Morning mist curled around the old trees like a veil draped over a dream not yet ready to wake. The air was still, so still that even a falling leaf made a sound. The Grayson estate emerged from the fog, silent and grand, like a memory no one dared to disturb. Clara Bennett stood before the tall iron gate, gripping a weathered suitcase and a worn letter of reference from the housekeeping agency. She carried no expectations, no illusions, just the quiet hope for a job, a rhythm steady enough to forget the noise of her past. The gate creaked open slowly, as if weighing the decision to let her in. A winding stone path led past wilted rose bushes and hedges trimmed with clinical precision. Everything was spotless, but nothing felt alive. The gatekeeper barely glanced at her before murmuring, "Back entrance, you're Bennett. Mrs. Whitmore's expecting you." The service door opened before Clara could knock. A silver-haired woman with a stern face and piercing eyes scanned her head to toe. "Not late. Good, punctuality is rule number 1 here." Clara gave a soft nod. "Understood. And the most important rule," she added as they stepped into a hallway thick with silence, "do not interact with Miss Ilara unless absolutely necessary." The inside of the house was quieter than the garden outside. Clara's footsteps echoed sharply against the stone floor, each one sounding like it stirred memories left undisturbed for too long. She followed Mrs. Whitmore through long corridors where thick curtains hung heavy, filtering the daylight into something dim and hesitant, like the house itself preferred the shadows. Every frame hung perfectly level, every vase polished to perfection. There was no dust, no sound, and not a trace of human warmth. "Miss Ilara stays in the east wing, top floor," Mrs. Whitmore murmured, as if afraid her voice might disrupt something fragile in the stillness. Clara simply nodded. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. From the moment she passed through the gate, she had felt it. This was a place where love had once lived, and then left. The family portraits still hung along the wall. One showed a beautiful woman with light in her eyes, caught mid-laugh, cradling a curly-haired little girl in her arms. Clara paused briefly, drawn in by that gaze. It looked like the kind of look someone gives when they're not ready to say goodbye. Ilara appeared without a sound, like a cloud drifting past a window. Clara was dusting the east corridor when she heard footsteps, soft as wind. She turned just in time to glimpse a small figure darting past the far end of the staircase. She didn't chase her. Instead, Clara set the cloth down and quietly followed where Ilara had gone. The hallway opened into a glass sunroom, where pale light filtered through towering windows, casting faded reflections of the back garden like an old, quiet painting. Ilara stood there, her back turned, shoulders trembling slightly as if resisting something unseen. Clara didn't speak. She wasn't even sure she was allowed to be there, let alone say a word. But something inside whispered, "Sometimes presence is enough." She slowly sat down on the floor. No call, no movement closer, just being there. A minute passed, then another. Nothing changed, and yet everything began to shift. At last Ilara turned. Her eyes were wide and deep, like galaxies suspended in silence. She looked at Clara, not with fear, not with curiosity, just looking. Clara offered a soft smile, her voice barely a breath. "Hello. You're Ilara, right?" "I'm Clara." No reply, but Ilara didn't run. Clara didn't wait for words. She remained, speaking as if to a breeze. "That tree out there looks like it's asleep, but I think it's just waiting for the sun." The days that followed passed in silence, but not the cold kind. It was the quiet of comfort, like a still lake beneath an autumn sky. Clara never sought out Ilara, yet every time she was dusting along the east corridor or tending to the back veranda, the girl would appear somewhere nearby, behind a doorway, at the end of the hall, or perched on the stone steps. Never too close, never too far. Like a wild bird watching to see if she was safe to approach. Clara went about her tasks as usual, cleaning windows, dusting shelves, polishing marble stair rails. Sometimes she hummed softly, not to draw attention, but because the old melodies brought her peace. They were lullabies from a childhood spent mostly in silence. And Ilara listened. Clara could feel it, even if no words were exchanged. One morning, while tidying the library, she heard faint footsteps behind her. She didn't turn, only said gently, "The butterflies in the garden have started to bloom. I saw a yellow one this morning, resting on the lavender. Its wings looked like a little piece of sunlight." No reply came, but when she glanced over her shoulder, Ilara was seated on the sofa, clutching a book nearly as big as she was. She didn't look at Clara, she was just there. Elsewhere in the house, Thomas Grayson watched quietly from his office, through the security monitors. Screens that once displayed only silence and absence now flickered with Clara's gentle presence. And the shift in his daughter's eyes. Ilara was no longer lost. She was listening. The storm didn't come from the sky. It began with a fallen photograph. That afternoon, Clara was wiping down the second-floor hallway when a sharp crash echoed from Ilara's room. The sound of breaking glass, sharp and quick like a cut. Then, silence. A silence too heavy, as if the entire house had stopped breathing. Clara ran toward the sound, heart pounding. The door to Ilara's room stood ajar. She gently pushed it open and stepped inside. Shards of glass were scattered like ice across the floor. A broken frame lay twisted at the center. And there, in the middle of it all, was Ilara, curled up, fists pressed to her temples, banging her head against the wall. A wordless cry. A wound that had never closed. Clara froze. And Lara. But the girl didn't hear. Clara stepped in slowly as if approaching a wounded animal. No one stopped her. Mrs. Whitmore and another maid stood frozen at the threshold. Thomas Grayson had rushed to the scene, but halted as he saw Clara kneel. Just an arm's length away, she didn't touch. She didn't command. She didn't soothe with empty phrases. Instead, she spoke in the same voice that once spoke of butterflies, trees, and sunlight. "The butterflies in the garden are almost ready. Remember the cocoons we saw last week? They'll have wings soon." Ilara kept hitting her head, but slower now. "Your mother had the most beautiful smile. Your eyes look just like hers, especially when you look at flowers." The movement stopped. Ilara trembled. Blood trickled from a small cut on her forehead, and then, like a dam bursting, she collapsed into Clara's arms, sobbing without a sound. Clara held her close. She said nothing. No logic, no fear of the mess, just her arms, steady, warm, safe. Thomas stood behind them, fists clenched white. Years of therapy, doctors, plans, and then a woman hired to clean had done what no one else could. In Clara's embrace, Ilara stopped shaking. And when that tiny hand clutched her shirt, there was no mistaking it. The storm had passed, and she had found her shelter. That morning's breakfast began like every other. Quiet, measured, slightly stiff. But since that day, Clara no longer sat at a distance. Thomas had asked her to join them, as part of a new rhythm, he called it. Clara hesitated, but Ilara gently pulled her hand, guiding it to the chair beside her. No words, just a look, a nod. On the table, the toast had been cut into playful shapes. A crescent moon, a tiny star. Clara's doing, unrequested. She whispered softly, "Like the star we saw outside the window last night, remember?" Ilara reached for the moon-shaped slice. Her fingers trembled slightly. Thomas folded his newspaper quietly, watching. The room filled with silence so deep it shimmered, not tense, but breathless. Waiting. Then, like a dream rising slowly from someplace deep, Ilara opened her mouth. "Mama!" The cup in Clara's hand nearly slipped. Thomas and Mrs. Whitmore froze. Ilara looked straight at Clara, her lips quivering, her gaze steady. "Mama." This time, louder, clearer, as if the syllables had lived inside her heart for years. just waiting for a safe place to be spoken. Clara rose quickly, as if the word had caught her off guard and pierced something tender. "No, Ilara, sweetheart, you don't have to call me that. I'm not—" Her voice faltered, cracking under the weight of a truth she wasn't ready to name. But Ilara had already climbed down from her chair, running to wrap her arms tightly around her. "Mama?" She whispered it again. And again. Each time a little steadier, a little softer, a little more like love. Thomas stood. His expression wasn't surprise, it was recognition. No one said anything else, no one needed to. Because sometimes one word speaks for an entire heart. The news spread like fire on wind. The Grayson girl, the child who hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, had finally said one. "Mama." The next morning, Margot Grayson, Thomas's younger sister, arrived unannounced. Her heels struck the marble floor like warning bells. "Where is she? The woman who's convinced my niece she's her mother?" Clara was arranging flowers in the foyer. Her hands froze. The roses trembled. Thomas emerged from the staircase, his gaze cold as steel. "Must you bring a storm into the morning, Margot?" "This isn't a storm, Thomas. It's clarity." "A housekeeper? Really?" But the reply didn't come from Thomas. It came from the hallway. "Mama!" Ilara appeared, small feet racing toward Clara, wrapping her arms around her waist as if the world were breaking apart. Margot fell silent. No one moved. Ilara looked up at Clara, then at her father, then she turned to the stranger, her voice clear, unwavering. "This is my mama." Just one sentence, but it rang through the estate like a bell in still air. Margot lowered her gaze. She said nothing more. Because no argument weighs more than the voice of a child who's been silent too long. Thomas stepped forward, standing beside Clara. His hand rested gently on her back, a wordless affirmation. "Family," he said quietly, "isn't always where you come from. Sometimes it's what you find." Night fell softly, like a thin blanket covering wounds not yet fully healed. The back garden welcomed the last light of day in silence, a soft lavender haze swaying gently in the breeze. Clara stood alone among the flowers. The moon had risen, and the wind slipped through her sleeves, cool and sharp. But she didn't move. Perhaps for the first time in years, she wasn't trying to escape. She needed the stillness. She needed to breathe. She needed to feel everything that had just begun to bloom. Footsteps approached behind her, steady, unhurried. Thomas. He didn't speak at first, just draped a long coat gently over her shoulders. His hand brushed her back, not forceful, just present. "You'll catch a chill," he murmured, eyes still on the sleeping flowers. Clara offered a faint smile. "I'm used to it. I once had just one coat for an entire winter." Silence passed between them. Not awkward, just filled with unspoken things. Then Thomas spoke, low and steady. "I thought I'd never feel anything again after Elena died. Every day became a performance. Being a father, a businessman, a strong man, but inside I felt hollow." Clara turned to him, her gaze softer than any word. "I understand. I lost my mother when I was 6, my father not long after. I grew up in a place where being strong was survival. But some nights, all I ever wanted was someone I could lean on. Just once." Thomas nodded. He didn't ask more. He didn't comfort. He just stood beside her. Sharing air, sharing grief. Then came soft footsteps on stone behind them. "Lara," Clara breathed. The girl ran toward them, wrapping her small arms around them both, burying her face between them, like that spot was the safest place in the world. Clara knelt, arms wrapping around her. Thomas sat beside them, placing one hand on Ilara's back and the other gently reaching for Clara's. In that moment, in the hush of moonlight and lavender, there were no titles, no past. Just 3 people, 3 heights, feeling each other simply by staying. "I love you, Mama," Ilara whispered into Clara's embrace, her voice sure, like her heart had finally found its own language. Clara held her tighter, tears falling gently onto soft hair. "I love you too, sweetheart, so very much." Thomas rested his hand on Clara's shoulder. "And I love you both." No one corrected Ilara. No one asked questions, because they all knew that voice hadn't come from therapy or logic. It had come from love, love that doesn't knock. It stays, and it is chosen. 1 year later, on a soft June afternoon, the back garden of the Grayson estate was draped in white flowers. There was no loud music, no grand art, just wooden tables, golden string lights, and rows of blooming lavender swaying in the breeze. Clara wore a simple dress, nothing glittering, but to Thomas, she shone brighter than anything he'd ever known. Ilara was the ring-bearer. She walked slowly down the flower-strewn path, her small white dress trailing behind her, holding a pillow where 2 rings rested side by side. When she reached Clara, she didn't speak, just handed over the pillow and wrapped her arms around her in a long, silent hug. A hug that said everything. "I choose you. Always." Their vows weren't poetic. They were honest, simple, the kind that grows slowly, quietly, and stays. 5 years later, children's laughter filled the garden. Not just one voice now, but 3. The twins Olian and Lyra raced across the grass, while Ilara followed, clutching a well-worn book of fairy tales. She was no longer the silent child of yesterday. Ilara was now a sister. Gentle, attentive, someone who knew how to listen and how to hold tight, just like she had once been held. Clara sat beneath a tree, Lyra resting her head on her lap, eyes half closed in the afternoon calm. Thomas stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her and pressed a soft kiss into her hair. They said nothing. They didn't have to, because the most important things had already been spoken years ago, in hugs, in glances, in the first whispered word of a girl who had once lived in silence. This family wasn't born of blood. It was built by choice, slowly, silently, and deeply. And love, real love, doesn't just stay. It becomes the walls, the laughter, the silence between heartbeats. It becomes home.